In this tutorial, we are going to see how to calculate the thermal time requirements for a crop to complete its growing cycle as a function of the typical duration of that cycle in days. We will be using as inputs for the calculations monthly average values of daily temperature. In this Excel, we have here some details concerning the crop that we are going to work with, which is rapeseed. We will suppose that this crop is sown on the 1st of December, and we will be growing the crop in Córdoba, whose average monthly temperatures in each month are given in this table. Well, the first thing we have to do is to get the duration of the growing cycle in days for our target crop. And we are going to decompose this growing cycle into the 4 stages of the FAO method. Let's look for the duration of these stages in the book of Principles of Agronomy for Sustainable Agriculture. And in particular, you should look for the appendix in chapter 11. In this appendix, you will find a list of crops, and you will find for each crop different durations of the 4 stages of the FAO method. Also, you will see that for each crop, you may have different growing cycles depending on the climate in which the crop is grown. M is for Mediterranean, A is for arid, SA is for subarid, T is for tropical, and so on and so forth. Then you also have differences in the duration of the cycles as a function of the sowing date. So when choosing the correct cycle, you should take into account the climate of your location and the sowing date. If we look in this appendix, we will find that rapeseed is not present. This may happen. But in table 10, in the first table of chapter 10, we are lucky to have data for rapeseed. This table shows that for rapeseed sown on November or December, the typical durations of the stages of the FAO method are those that appear in these highlighted cells. So we should choose durations for each stage that are within this interval, and we will assume that these are the typical durations for the stages in our location, in this case Córdoba. I'm going to assume that I have 35 days in stage A, 35 in stage B, 65 in stage C, and 35 in stage D. You can also take the midpoint of the durations if you like. Well, so according to table 10.1, I'm going to consider these typical durations for my location. Well, stage A will start in the date of sowing, which is the 1st of December. So stage B will start 35 days later. The same criteria can be used to deduce when we will have the starting date of the 4 stages. The end will be the previous day to the start of the following stage. And well, in this case, okay. So our growing cycle will finish in typical years around 19th of May. Now let's calculate the thermal time requirements, and for this we have to review the concept of thermal time. Remember that we calculate the thermal time that is accumulated in a single day from the difference between the average daily temperature and base temperature. Here in this table we have average values of monthly temperature for each of the months of the year in Cordoba. We now need information on the base temperature, which is specific for our crop. For looking for this value of base temperature, we should go again to the book, and we will find this information on the table. I think it's the first table in chapter 16. Let's look for it. Okay, here it is. Once again, here in this table you have a list of crops. Here you have the thermal time required for completing the period between sowing and emergence. And in the right column you have typical values of base temperature for these crops. If we look for rapeseed, we find that the base temperature is 2.6 degrees. So if we have this base temperature, on an average day of January, we will be accumulating 8.3 minus 2.6 degree days. And we can apply this formula to the 12 months. Well, now that we know how much thermal time is accumulated in a typical day of each month, and that we know the durations and typical starting and ending dates of each stage of the cycle, we can calculate how much thermal time is required to complete each stage. So, for instance, in the case of stage A, the crop will stay in the field for 31 days in December, and in these 31 days we'll be accumulating on average 6.5 degree days per day. And also it will stay in the field for 4 further days in January. So we should consider the thermal time accumulated in a typical day of January in 4 days. Okay, we apply the same criteria to the following stages. So, for instance, so it's 22 days, right? Yeah, 27 days in January, plus 8 days in February. Now we have 20 days in February, plus the whole month of March in stage C, plus 14 days in April. And finally, for stage D, we have 16 days in April, plus 19 days in May. So these are the typical thermal time requirements to complete each of the stages of the FAO method. The cumulative thermal time required to get to the starting point to the end of each of these stages can be calculated easily by accumulating the values since the beginning. And finally, we get to the final result, which is that the growing cycle will take on average 1600 degree days.